Hi, I'm Wes Allen with DM Tales, and today I'm looking at the fourth post-apocalyptic role-playing game on my channel. This is part one of my look at Mutant Year Zero. Let's roll it. Mutant Year Zero, as I said in the opening, is a post-apocalyptic role-playing game. It is probably more gritty than the other games that I've looked at this channel already, and I also mentioned that this is part one of my review. And that's because Mutant Year Zero is really three games rolled up into one. The first, which I'm covering today, is the traditional role-playing game. Players are mutants of unknown origin. They don't know where they came from. They don't know how they came to be. And one of the interesting things that plays into the game is that the mutants cannot breed amongst themselves. So if you lose people in your settlement, that's a really big deal because attrition is going to eventually knock you out of existence. It's a very interesting take on survival concepts. There are 4 attributes in the game: strength, agility, wits, and empathy, and attributes are point buy. Players have 14 points to distribute across the 4 scores as they see fit. And your scores are important because this is the number of dice that you roll as your base dice. We'll get into that in a little bit. Classes are referred to as roles in this game, and there are 8 of them. Each role has a certain number of talents, and their history gives them a certain outlook on life, which allows them to have different desires and goals and really dictates how they're going to make contacts inside your settlement, which is called the Ark, before the game begins. Aside from your attributes, players also have something called skill points. And skill points are actually built off of your attributes, but there are certain things that you can level up. And so at the beginning of the game, players have 10 points to distribute between their basic skills. These are things like fight and shoot. These are real combat-y skills that are going to be important out in the zone. Each player also, because they are mutants, has a mutation or 2 if they're willing to knock down one of their ability scores by 1. And every game or every adventure, players start with a number of mutation points equal to the number of mutations that they have. And every time you activate a mutation, it costs 1 mutation point. You can also use more than 1 mutation point to activate a mutation, and that gives you more dice to roll to see if it's successful or not. In addition, certain aspects of the game allow the players to accumulate mutation points during the course of the game, and these can be pooled and stored over adventure from adventure, but a player can never have more than 10 at a time. Experience points are handed out 1 at a time based on certain criteria, and when a player accumulates 5 experience points, they can either raise one of their attributes by 1 or learn a new talent, which gives them special abilities to use in conflicts and exploration. So you have a good balance of choice there for how you want your character to progress. And every time you get to 5 and you level up, as it were, you start back at 0 until you get 5 again, and you're able to advance your character again. Really simple, really nice, and your advancement is rather fast, which is good because Mutant Year Zero is really a gritty game with a high attrition rate. The role mechanics for Mutant Year Zero are, from what I gather, what Free League publishing games all use. It's called the Year Zero engine. And essentially, you have a pool of 6-sided dice. 1s are considered failures, 6s are considered successes. The other numbers apparently just don't matter, so they're sad. Though for reasons that are kind of beyond me, Free League has decided that they want to have custom dice for their game. And so what they've done is they've taken their dice and they've replaced a 6 with a nuclear symbol and a 1 with a biohazard symbol, and they did this for dice reasons, I guess, more merchandising. I actually found the book a little harder to read because they kept on replacing 1s and 6s with biohazard and nuclear, and it took a while for my brain to actually kick in as to which was which. The heart of the mechanic for the Year Zero engine is the skill check. And the skill check is basically based on your attributes. Every skill is linked to a core attribute, and that's your number of base die that you have. So if you have a strength of 4, you get 4 base die to roll. And then if you're using a particular skill like fight and you're level 2 in that, you get 2 skill dice to roll. And these should be different colors so you can differentiate between them. And you get to roll them together. But that's not all. You also have gear dice. So if you are using a baseball bat or some other melee weapon, and that gives you a gear bonus, you can roll a gear dice as well. Although the gear dice 1 doesn't have the biohazard symbol, it has an explosion, and this indicates gear failure because pictures are good. If a PC rolls their dice and a 6 shows up, there's a success. And if not, there is a failure. And the GM then has to narrate that failure. One of the things that Mutant Year Zero points out is that the one thing a GM cannot say is nothing happens. Something has to happen as a result of an action that a PC takes, whether it's success or failure. If a PC is desperate to succeed, however, or if they want to roll more than 1 6 in order to succeed, then a player can do what's called pushing the roll. This is pushing their ability to the limits. And what they can do is take everything that's not a 1 or a 6 on those dice, and they can re-roll them and try to get more 6s. However, there are consequences with this. First, whatever attribute is used for that skill check suffers trauma for each one that you roll in both the rolls, the first and the second. And the initial effect that trauma has on your character is that you lose that amount of dice to roll for your base dice. And that can be troublesome because it makes it harder to succeed later on. Second, every time you fail, you get a mutation point. So that's one way that you accumulate mutation points. So there's an offsetting cost and benefit into failing a roll. Dice rolls can be modified, so you'll see the same thing that you'll see in many other RPGs, a +1, a +2, a -1, a -2, a -3, that sort of thing. But in this game, it's not a minus to the result of the roll, it's a minus to the number of dice that are thrown. It's a really elegant and simple system that I'm kind of interested in using at some point. And finally, in the mechanic, there is something called opposed rolls, which is when 2 characters, or a character and an NPC, make a skill check against each other, and whoever rolls more 6s, they're the ones who succeed. Again, really simple, really effective, and really, really fast. So I'm really impressed on the mechanic there. I've already mentioned mutations. They can be very haphazard and a little bit dangerous. When you roll a die to check to see if your mutation activates or not, if you get a 1, there is a misfire. Then you have to make a second roll on a table. And the result on that table is what happens. You can inflict damage on yourself, or you can unleash twice the amount of power that you initially intended to unleash. It's all rather random at that point. So your mutations are cool, and they offer a certain amount of power to your character, but the risk of using them is also there at all times. You have a 1 in 6 chance on any roll of having a misfire, and that's going to screw up your character in a little bit. Conflict is handled with the same mechanic as a skill check. You have fight, you have shoot, that's for melee and ranged attacks accordingly, and essentially you roll your strength, your fight level, and whatever gear that you're using, and a 6 hits. When an attack hits, it does the amount of damage that's in the weapon line. It's usually 2 or 3, depending on how powerful the weapon is. And this gets applied to trauma against the target's strength. The one thing that can knock down those damage points a little bit is armor, because every armor has an armor rating, and that number offsets whatever damage your weapon does. So if you do 2 points of damage and someone is wearing armor that has a protection rating of 2, you do no damage. You can apply a special effect called a stunt for every 6 that you roll above the initial 6. And this can be from anything from inflicting more damage, so you want to overcome someone's armor rating, that's what you do, to inflicting fatigue on someone. So you're just beating them down so much, and they're not taking damage, but they're getting tired. They can't get away from the onslaught of the blows. And so that's one way of implementing that effect into the game. So even if someone's not taking damage, they're still taking trauma. This is really kind of interesting. The way that Mutant Year Zero handles damage is not as abstracted as, say, in D&D or in a lot of OSR games with these generic hit points. Each of your attributes can suffer trauma, And when you get to a level of trauma where your pool of base dice for that attribute becomes 0, you're broken. And you essentially can't do anything until you somehow recover from your trauma. And worse, any broken character on any attribute, when they are down, any damage they take will just kill them instantly. So there's a high risk to carrying around a load of trauma. If your strength score becomes 0, then the character suffers a critical injury and you roll on that table and you suffer with that result. You can bleed off your trauma points when you are in a place of safety, but every time you do so, there's actually a chance that that trauma can become permanent and you just stay carrying it around, which lowers your ability to accomplish tasks, and worse, it accelerates the progress toward being broken. So this is a dangerous game. There's a lot of stress involved in the way that it's designed. One of the things that I found interesting about Mutant Year Zero is that the world is small. A GM is encouraged to make their own zone that is near an old settlement. And in fact, they're encouraging people to maybe make their zone near where they live so they can add some realism to the game. But the grid really is only supposed to be about 20 miles wide, and that's 20 squares on the grid. Well, this world is unknown, it's unexplored, and 20 miles doesn't seem that far when you compare some of the homebrew worlds where people are doing 2 and 3 day journeys between different places. Everything just feels so compact. Moving through this zone becomes a sort of mini hex crawl. Every time you enter into a zone, it takes a certain amount of time to get into it, and then it takes a certain amount of time to explore it and discover what its properties are. If there's any artifacts, if there's any ruins to explore, if there's any specific dangers that are endemic to that grid square. As parties go out into the zone, they have to make sure that they have enough food, which is referred to as grub in this game, and water, because finding clean grub and water out in the zone is really, really difficult. And if you become either hungry or dehydrated, there are serious penalties that will hinder your character's ability to survive. In addition to this, out in the zone, there is this disease called the rot, which is never really kind of explained, but the rot will accumulate in characters' bodies and can also break them. Like all trauma in the game, you can bleed off rot points when you get to a place of safety, but there's a chance, always, every time you bleed off a point, that that point of rot becomes permanent. The zones in the game have different levels of rot. Some are very clean. These are few and far between. Some will give you 1 rot point per day that you spend inside the zone. Others are going to give you 1 per hour, and then others are going to give you 1 point per minute. So you need to get out of that zone as fast as you possibly can. It is a fascinating take on exploration. It is very, very, very gritty. That's really what differentiates Mutant Year Zero from games like Gamma World or Mutant Future or Barbarians of the Ruined Earth, where these other games are gonzo is kind of the word that people like to use for it, where it's really science fantasy at the highest level. People have these fantastic mutations, and civilization has had a little bit of a time to coalesce back into something where you have places you can go for safety and to do trade and to barter and even sometimes use cash. In Mutant Year Zero, none of that exists. The world is unknown. Society has broken. There's just junk and garbage and overgrowth and mutated animals and rot everywhere that you can see. And your people are on the verge of extinction because they can't breed. So the word that I would really use to describe Mutant Future, the role-playing game, is intense, because everything has a consequence. Everything holds a risk of imminent danger and significant trauma being inflicted on your character. So if you want to play a role-playing game to have a relaxing, good time, this is probably not the game that you want to use. If you love being on the edge of your seat and you want to see if you can just get over the next horizon and survive to the next day, and that's really what makes you excited about playing a role-playing game, then Mutant Year Zero, that's really something you want to take a look at. This is a cool one. Gonna have to see if I'm gonna run it. Until then, happy playing, everyone.